Interestingly, right at that point, there was a new movement developing. John Salter, one of the professors on campus, had begun working with Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP, to develop a student movement that would eventually rock the foundations of the city of Jackson and the state of Mississippi.
I've heard at various times from the reporter, the cameraman, and the son of one of the reporters that this was the most terrifying, frightening event they covered in the civil rights movement. Now, I guess they weren't in Birmingham or Montgomery with the Freedom Riders, but they got around, and this to them was the worst.
When we had seen Memphis kicked in the head, he had blood coming out his nose and ears, which is not a scratch. Anything could have happened to anybody.
Joan sees all this and realizes, first of all, she is beginning to communicate with the demonstrators. She sees a man with a knife walk by Ann Moody, and she calls out, Annie, he's got a knife. And all of a sudden, she's identified with the people at the counter. Who's this white girl talking to those black girls, you know? So all of a sudden, she realizes that she's in danger.
But then I sat down. That's when I became a problem.
She walked through that mob in the Woolworth store. And they realized, of course, immediately where she stood.
She joins Perlina and Annie at the counter, the first white to join the demonstration. And at this, the crowd is just incensed. They become like hornets. They start screaming at her, you black bitch, you white nigger, you traitor, communist.
Yelling, screaming, cursing, laughing, a lot of loud laughter, dirty jokes being cracked, racist remarks. Anytime people went to the counter, though, it was like the crowd, the mob, really turned into an animal, and just an angry roar when they realized someone else was not afraid of them.
One of the white guys who was in league with Benny Oliver grabs Joan and pulls her off the stool. Another one grabs Annie Mooney and pulls her off and drags them to the back of the store and out the door. Joan, it's interesting, she kept her composure, and once outside of the store, what we see is this white, tough guy pulling on a white Southern girl. And the police arrest the guy and let Joan go back in the store. So he is arrested and carted off, and she's let to go back in the store. Annie is standing right there at the entrance. Somewhere she's lost her shoes, but they're both okay. And they both decided they're safer if they get back to Perlina and back to the counter. So that's what they do. They make their way back through a throng of a couple of hundred people by this point, back to the counter.
I went immediately to the lunch counter to sit with Joan and Annie Moody. A white man, mistaking me identity-wise and mission-wise, yelled out, "Hit him hard, boy. Hit him." But then I sat down with them, and the crowd was quiet for just one moment, and then I heard my name mentioned by somebody. And then they moved in on me.
At that point, Joan has said that she believed that they were not going to make it out alive. None of them were going to make it out alive.
I think I was beyond fear. I think I was driven by determination to carry this through. And by the time we sat at the counter a while, it was like an out-of-body experience that the real me had left the body, and it was just a shell there. And the real me was sort of up above, like a guardian angel, letting me know what was happening and protecting me to some extent. But the real essence of me, the important part, was already out of there.
I think the best way to put it is that it was a very interesting afternoon, to put it mildly.
while they're being mic'd, I'm going to endeavor to introduce them, and I'll start right here on my left, the panel's right, with the Reverend Ed King. He's actually on the Ole Miss faculty at the Medical Center and has been for some time. I believe he was at one time on the faculty at Millsaps. Adjunct. And you know, a Methodist minister, ordained, and a long-time activist in the civil rights movement. Went through some very, very dangerous and violent times in the 60s. Next to his left is Michael O'Brien, who wrote the book, We Shall Not Be Moved, and heroes of the of the Woolworth incident in Jackson. And Michael's book explores this in great detail, starting, I believe, from the Woolworth protest and events surrounding it, and going through primarily the next 3 weeks.
Exactly right.
And then deals with the lives of the participants since then. To his left is Loki Mulholland, who put together the documentary, a snippet of which you just saw, and that will be shown, as you heard, this weekend at the Oxford Film Festival, about the role his mother played in the movement. And that's his mother to the left of him, Joan Mulholland. She was Joan Trumpauer at the time, I believe, a former student at Duke and at Duke University, and at that time a student at Tougaloo College, who joined the protest movement and had tons of condiments poured on her head and got a few blows for the trouble. But Joan has another claim to fame. You were a freedom rider, weren't you?
Yes.
She came. That's how she came south. She came to Jackson on a bus. If you have never read about the Freedom Riders and you're a student at Ole Miss, you owe it to yourself to go over to the library and do a little research that will raise the hair on your head. So we're going to start with just asking a few questions about the incident itself, okay? And I'm going to start with Joan, because you just happened to be moving when I looked your direction. Well, Joan, people today can't conceive of such a thing happening. What was it like for you to step forward and sit there on that lunch counter? How on earth did you muster the courage to do it? And once you'd done it, were there any quick regrets that jumped into your mind?
No, I wouldn't. No regrets then or ever. I was a Southerner, and Southerners are determined folks. We all know that. And actually, I was safer at the counter than I was if I were recognized in the crowd. The counter, you had, the guys were behind you. They wouldn't be in front of you, and the press was behind the counter and could point their cameras at the crowd, so that was a place of safety.
When did you realize you were in big trouble?
Never.
Never. You have more courage than I do.
I mean, you knew what could happen, or you wouldn't have been there to begin with. So once you accept that, what's the worst that can happen? They can kill you. Well, we all think there's a better life in the next world, so
So
we'll go when it's time.
faith played a role in your role in the movement?
Oh, definitely. That's one of the things that took me. In Sunday school, we had to memorize all these verses, King James Version of, inasmuch as you've done it unto the one of the least of these, you've done it unto me, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we were supposed to believe this, but we weren't doing it. And I thought we should. And as a Southerner, I thought I should do what I could to be honest and to make my home the best that it could be for everybody.
Okay. Ed, you were one of the organizers, weren't you?
Yes.
Well, you know, what on earth possessed y'all to do this at Woolworth's lunch counter in Jackson, Mississippi, downtown on Capitol Street, I think it is?
All of those were specific parts of the planning or plot, and you might as well call it a plot, Woolworth was the scene of the first sit-in 1960. College students in Greensboro, North Carolina, and then black students, and then quickly joined, as Joan says, by white students at Duke and at UNC Chapel Hill. So Woolworth had a national significance. Medgar Evers was leading the Jackson movement, and part of that was a boycott of all the white merchants on Capitol Street, where in many stores blacks could not even try on shoes. Most black women could not try on clothes. The lunch counter was a symbol for that whole set of segregation. We talked about employment of blacks. Medgar Evers led this demonstration, but he let us do it as if there were no specific organization doing it. My role during the demonstration, I had on my clerical collar. I was a spotter. And the role of spotters was not to get arrested, not even to intervene if somebody was killed, but to have an accurate report of what went on. And every few minutes, I put another nickel or dime in and telephoned Medgar describing what was happening. And he couldn't come down either. He felt terrible. He thought people might die. He was willing to do that. He had to stay where he was to alert the national media.
Where were the police?
The police, eventually over 50 of them, were standing right outside Woolworth's. They had just arrested several demonstrators from Tougaloo College, including my ex-wife, Jeanette, and the president of the Tougaloo student body, at a corner, the busiest corner on Capitol Street. We thought that would be the major event of the arrest. We had just had a Supreme Court decision that week that said you had a right as an American citizen to demonstrate, and that included picketing, which the police ignored, but inside a store, the police could not enter unless the store manager requested police assistance, or there was an obvious breakdown. There was an obvious breakdown, but the police let the mob form and come in and attack us for 3 hours.
Michael, tell us how you came to write the book, and were you surprised at some of the things you found in your research?
Well, the book itself came about actually as an inspiration by the photograph. I was friends with the Mulholland family for many, many years and was aware of the photograph, but it wasn't until I saw it in a very kind of historic site at the King Center in Atlanta, merged in with a lot of other iconic civil rights photographs, that I realized that this was, that I had a connection directly to that photograph and those people there, and perhaps had a unique opportunity to connect with them and talk with them. So it was after seeing that iconic photograph in that setting that I realized I needed to start interviewing at least Joan. And then Joan led me to others like Ed and John Salter and Annie Moody and the whole rest of them until it actually then developed into a project. I really wasn't that familiar with all the ins and outs of the civil rights movement, and particularly not with the Jackson movement, until I started delving into it. And it is quite a story. I was very fortunate that although there are obviously memoirs that have been written about this, John Salter has written his own memoir. Ann Moody, of course, coming of age in Mississippi, spends a bit of time on the Jackson movement. Ed King is writing his own memoir, and it will be released someday. But there was nothing that had kind of taken the whole period and tried to put it into historical perspective. So that's what I tried to do.
Right. Loki, it's kind of obvious, but why did you choose to do this documentary at this time? And did you learn something in the process of doing the documentary that you had not learned before?
Oh gosh, yeah, I learned quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I like to say, most people's parents have prom photos and stuff, and mine's a mugshot and this. And later on, when I learned that my mother was a death row inmate and ex-con, I just had to make a movie out of it.
We'll explain that in a minute.
But really, it was growing up, all we really had were the photos. My mother never really talked about the events. Now, Ed and Memphis and others would come over and stuff, but they would come with their kids and things, and we didn't want to hear old people talk. So, you know, we was polite enough to hang around till my mother said we could leave, and then we would run away. And it was just kind of generally through osmosis I would start to get these stories, and then just like with Mike, with John Salter's book and Moody's book, I would begin to pick these stories up. It really wasn't until an article, a blog post from, I always butcher his first name, Mr. Coates on The Atlantic, the senior editor. He had, the mugshots had just come out for the Freedom Rides, and he had written a post about that, particularly about my mother's. And seeing the reaction people had to her story, even just this small snippet that they knew of the Freedom Rides, I didn't even know what the Freedom Rides were when that came out. You know, that's, my whole life is embarrassing regarding this. But we had the opportunity to come down to Jackson on the 50th anniversary 2 years ago, and I knew then at that point that I had to take advantage of it, and really I learned all these things. My mother, if I may, I read an excerpt from Mike's book. He had supplied it, and that's really where a lot of the information came from. And I read this part where when my mother was born, her mother got sick, you know, I put that in quotes, and so she was raised by a black woman for the first few months of her life. News to me. So I called my mother. I said, Mom, how come you never told us that you were raised by a black woman? She said, well, you never asked. I said, well, so was I supposed to say, Mom, were you ever raised by a black woman for the first few months of her life? She goes, well, it would help. And that was basically how, you know, those things came about. People ask, how did you not know? Well, there you go. I convinced her that it was good for the grandchildren, that they need to know this. And so using my own children as kind of, you know, a blackmail tool, it worked great. And here we are.
And he did not have full disclosure about what he was going about this. I thought it was going to be on a lot of the lesser known folks who had been participating. I didn't realize they would just merely be interviewed and I would be the focus, but you know, devious ways that these children have. I'd like to throw in one thing. This Supreme Court decision that folks were talking about that had said that the police could not, of their own volition, come into a store and make arrest of demonstrations. That grew out of cases that came out of the sit-ins, including the Durham, North Carolina sit-ins, and I was one of the plaintiffs on that. Not the first name, you know, like Brown versus Board of Education. It was a consolidation of cases, but the irony of a Supreme Court decision that involved me keeping the police from coming in and saving us, that was humorous once we found out.
I would be remiss if I did not point out, third from the left at the lunch counter, the young black woman with the stripe down her head from whatever's been poured on it. That is, isn't that Annie Moody?
That's it.
Yes.
Okay, and Annie Moody wrote a kind of I think, a fairly famous at the time book on growing up in Mississippi, which was
coming of age in Mississippi.
Coming of age. There you go. Coming of age in Mississippi, and I commend it to you for a view of that time. But Joan, he mentioned that you were on death row and you had your mug shot. Explain, you know, what happened when you got off the bus in Jackson and how you managed to wind up at Parchman.
Yeah, actually, I took a train from New Orleans to Jackson, and the rest were very routine. The Kennedy administration and the Mississippi power structure had struck a deal. There could be arrest for breaking local laws, and there, in return, would be no violence. Well, then the Freedom Riders took on a Fill the Jails campaign to make it real inconvenient for the power structure. And we filled the Hinds County Jail to where there were about, in the white woman's cell, 3 square feet of floor space per person, which made the nights rather interesting. And so they decided just to have a place to put us. They would clear the death row in Parchman and take us up there, which in many ways was an improvement. It was more spacious, it was cleaner, the food was definitely better. but the intimidation value was amazing, that you were there completely at their mercy, and no one, you couldn't reach out to anybody or scream bloody murder and be heard on the streets of Jackson. You were completely within their power, and that got a lot of people. But hey, it was free room and board for the summer, and I'd already been accepted at Tougaloo, so I hung in there.
Now, can you tell them who you introduced Mississippi to?
Who came with you on
Who
the
came
train
with
ride?
you on your train ride?
Stokely Carmichael. For those who don't know, Black Power. And Stokely and I were friends until the end.
Ed, all the arrests, all the beatings, the death of Medgar Evers, the deaths of others, I think you were beaten too, probably more than once. I don't know. Was it worth it?
We're here. I'm a retired Ole Miss faculty member from the Medical Center on Mississippi State retirement, which is very good, and I hope people leave it alone in the legislature. No, the very fact that we can ask these questions, that we certainly have friends who died during the time. The price was enormous. I don't know anybody who thought they would live more than 15, 20 years. Most of us didn't think we'd live more than 1 or 2 years. It was worth it. Let me put some little footnotes to the picture.
Yeah.
The first 3 people in the sit-in, Perlina Lewis, who's in some of the other famous pictures, and Memphis Norman, were all Mississippians. And we were making a point because the governor and the mayor were saying, black people in Mississippi are happy in their place. So the first 3 demonstrators were all black. Memphis Norman was pulled from a stool, beaten on the ground, kicked. I guess that was in the little film there. But he was a native from South Mississippi. The first 3. Then Medgar had to decide, do we call the demonstration off? We don't know whether Memphis is even alive. And then the decision was, volunteers will come. And Medgar couldn't come himself. But that's how you get other people in here. Woman who graduated from Robert E. Lee High School in Virginia, and John Salter. They have replaced people who've already been terribly beaten, and they knew what might happen. This looks like black and white Americans. It's really more iconic even than that. Joan, Virginia, and a Georgia family background. John Salter's New England and New York background is the William James and Henry James family. But he hates to be called white because he is legally an Abenaki American Indian. That's a tribe in Maine and Canada. So we have Southern whites, Southern blacks, and American Indians in this famous photograph. Didn't plan it quite that carefully.
So, Michael, do you think it was different for the white people in the movement, particularly natives of the area, than it was for black people in the movement?
Well, in this particular picture, just to take as an example, they certainly took off after the whites, the white males in particular, at least as hard as they did the one black male that we saw being taken out. John Salter, when he sat down at the counter, he gave you a little bit of a sense of what happened, but not only they put cigarettes out in the back of his neck, they break a sugar container and cut the back of his neck and the side of his face. They throw something akin to pepper spray into his eyes so that they feel like they're burning out. Somebody comes up behind him and pounds him with a set of brass knuckles, hoping that he'll fall off the stool. But it was that Native American in him, I think, that just made him hold on, and he wasn't going to let anybody see that he was even hurt. I think that Ed could probably answer your question a little bit better about whites versus blacks and how they were treated in the movement. I wanted to just go back to one quick thing that Loki and Joan were talking about, and that was the fact that Joan often would not talk. It's only recently that she has begun to discuss kind of publicly her civil rights activities. And for many years, so it's not a surprise to me that Loki never knew about it. Again, when Ed and other people would come to her home, they would get into these very intense conversations about what had happened to them in Mississippi. But Joan, like a lot of others, I think during the normal course of her life, kind of put it in the past. And my sense is also there was a bit of a kind of emergence from a traumatic experience going on there. So it's only been more recently that she and others have really come to terms with it, and I think been able to put it in perspective and begin to share it with others.
Lucky.
Yeah, by the time she came to Mississippi on the Freedom Rides, she had already been involved in over 3 dozen sit-ins and protests. She was only 19. And so by the time she left the movement as a student, I mean, she had been at war for 4 years. And I think anytime it's not a cheap pitch for the film, I'm just saying, but in the film, there's so much more she went through. And when you see the intensity of all those things, it's no wonder you want to just kind of move on to the next chapter. And I mean, I think you said it.
Bloom where you're planted.
Right.
My belief was that where you find yourself, you deal with that space. And I went to Mississippi as a student. I graduated. It was time to leave. But I think I took the experiences and insights and just way of thinking with me in the jobs that I ended up having, and plus raising 5 boys.
That's a war in itself.
That was traumatic enough.
So now in retirement, or as the kids move out of the house, you have time to review your life and answer the call there.
So it affected you really for the rest of your life in some ways. It becomes part of your life experience, and you draw upon it in raising your children?
Raising my children, they ended up going to schools where there was absolutely no majority population, except briefly when it was 52% Southeast Asian divided 3 ways. I worked in schools with no majority, many kids who did not speak English at home, and just the way of thinking outside the box that I got as a minority, sometimes of one at Tougaloo, and with the movement experience, I could bring that way of looking at things into the classroom, plus incorporate some of the events into the lesson plans when they weren't written in by the state.
Loki, I see you straining at the leash.
Oh, I am straining at the leash. I just, I can't help but think, the civil rights movement, in particular, the peaceful nonviolence, and how somehow that ended when she left the movement, because, boy, she believed in corporal punishment.
Take off your belt and lean over. And now that could get me arrested for child abuse. Not back in the day.
So, Ed, how did it change you? How did it really change your life, affect your life once the 60s wound down, once the real height of the danger and the violence wound down? What did it do to you?
I would join others in the late 60s putting things into perspective, especially with the development of Black Power, separatism, people turning to violence, people that I knew as friends who still were friendly with me. And I was one of those who started, like Joan, from Southern church background and had already wrestled with things. So I did not believe that violence would work. And I could look at the movement, but I could also say that 50, 60, 70 years from now, historians may say that Dr. King and the nonviolent movement failed, and that the Black community would have come further had it used violence. I don't think so. I have not been as removed as Joan has, because I've been giving lectures, several lectures every year at everywhere from Harvard to Berkeley and Stanford, and some out of the country. I later worked with the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches. But I also had a ministry, a pastoral ministry, to broken, wounded movement people over the years who broke down because of what they had been through. They held up for that moment, but it didn't last. Let me mention something else about this picture. And It's very hard for whites not to feel like, I didn't know that was going on. You weren't supposed to know that was going on. What we had to demonstrate was that black people are standing up and are not going to put up with it, and had to demonstrate to white people what is the price of enforcing racism. And you are a part of it. When the people sat down at the lunch counter, most of the whites scattered. At the end of the room was a lunch counter for blacks. At the white-only lunch counter, one white woman did not scatter. She finished eating her dessert, apologized to Ann Moody that she had to leave, then came over to me. She may even have recognized me. She was from Vicksburg. My uncle was sheriff, and my grandfather was sheriff. My great-grandfather fought with General Lee. I don't think she knew me, but it's possible. But she wanted to make it clear that she wished she could stay at that counter. And she said, I want you to tell them. I tried to tell them. Some of us in Mississippi have been waiting for this day. We are so glad you're having this demonstration. If I stay any longer, I'll be identified, but I'm from Vicksburg, and my husband will lose his job. That's pressure. Those people didn't know about the torture. Medgar Evers, who led this demonstration, 4 days later has a demonstration with over 1,000 black high school and junior high school students, 400 of whom are imprisoned in the fairgrounds and brutally tortured. I interviewed some. I can say that. I was there a few days later and have been tortured. People didn't know that, but this woman knew that her family, her husband's job was at stake, and she had made quite a sacrifice by just pausing. A few minutes after she left, another white woman came up in her mid to late 20s and started dancing around almost like a ballet performance, twirling, holding a ketchup bottle up in the air, and then went forward and started putting ketchup on the victims. And the mob cheered, and then the mob poured forth to put mustard, as you see on Ann, and others. People couldn't imagine that whites could be that terrible, but people can't imagine that there were two unknown white women there, the one in the mob and the one who wanted to be part of the demonstration. You have to appeal to the best that's in the people. If you don't, others will bring out the worst in me and in you.
This, Michael, this photo, why? Can you put your finger on why it's so iconic? And did it have an effect of some sort?
Well, you mentioned, Bill, that it was a photograph that went around the world, and that is true. Although, frankly, the photo that was most represented on the next day's newspapers was a very famous photo of Memphis Norman being kicked. It wasn't until much later that this photo began to circulate and become now what is considered the iconic sit-in photograph of the era. And I think what is interesting about it, it just has all the elements of drama. I mean, it has an interesting line. The center is this person pouring, sugar over Joan's head. It's got the sad-looking Ann Moody. And then it's got all these characters, cast of characters behind. I was lucky enough to be able to find some of those people and to interview them. The guy with the cigarette in his mouth, we did a long interview, and his life story, in fact, is in the book. There were the FBI agents with their shades on in the background. It has a little bit of everything. It's got the drama and the pathos, I think, of a really strong black and white photograph of the era.
Yeah, we've got a lot of journalism students here. Wait, first, let me see what
I would like to speak a little to that photo. I think it's become so iconic because it's been used in so many books for school children. You've got a mixed group at the counter. You have obviously a lot of violence and tension, but at that exact moment there is no punch-em-out violence taking place. So it's a good one to use for children. Beyond that, it's been the basis for a number of illustrators working on children's books. But in every case, I have a suntan, a very deep tan. They never changed John Salter into a black guy and leave me alone. but they always change me into black. And I wonder what that says about our society. I don't think it's coincidence.
But Joan makes an interesting point. It's not only been represented now as a photograph, but the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis has a full-life kind of body, full-size display.
Cast in concrete like Jimmy Hoffa, yeah.
with some of these elements in it, including Joan and her bun and all that. So it's interesting. It's become part of the popular culture and art.
I'm curious as to whether any of you have run into any of the people in the mob since this incident happened in the years that have passed, and whether they expressed any regret, remorse, or apology.
No.
No. No.
I have.
Have?
But I'm there. Not remorse and apology from those, but I have had several people, men over the years, say, I was there, and I'm ashamed that I didn't do something to stop it, or so on. I was going to the edge of the mob with clerical collars, a Methodist minister, and I turned away about 50 white people. I would say, are you shocked at what's happening? Well, I don't like segregation, but is that blood on that man? And said, yes, that's blood. Do you want to continue shopping here? Why don't you just leave? And I'm serious. Over about an hour's time, at least 50 people said, that's not the white South I want to be part of, and left. And I'm glad that years later, people sort of said, I have some shame that I didn't help. I know one young man came to me in his 30s or 40s, who had become a very progressive attorney taking current modern civil rights cases. And he said his feeling, he was a high school senior and saw what was happening and the response of the people, and that he couldn't do anything then, but with the rest of his life he would. Another man who came to me and said he was a high school senior, saw what was happening and left, became a minister in the Methodist Church, went to Millsaps College the next year, moved out of state, but he wasn't run out of state. In every denomination, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, clergy were forced to leave Mississippi. Probably 40 or more in the Methodist Church alone, the white church. So for this guy to become a minister and stay, he didn't leave because of that. It was just normal opportunity.
So we've got some journalism students here, so I feel like I ought to ask, how did the Jackson papers cover this news event? I mean, we know about the picture, but how did the Jackson papers and TV stations cover this? I'm guessing Michael and Loki looked at that in the process of what you did.
Yeah, I had to, obviously in trying to tell the whole story, I went through all the news sources. I was even able to get the FBI reports through Freedom of Information Act request. And the local newspapers actually covered it very thoroughly. In fact, some of the best reporting in terms of the names of people that were in the crowd, the names of and the ages of the people who were arrested. It didn't appear to me, comparing their coverage to, say, the New York Times or other papers that were a little bit further removed, it actually appeared to me that the local papers did a better job in some regards. Now, there were reasons for that. They would actually publish the addresses of the demonstrators, so that if somebody wanted to, get in touch with their parents or harass them, they could do that. But overall, it was front page coverage. There were photographs. There were photographs for the next several days of this event. So I think in all, they did a pretty good job.
How about the TV stations?
Okay, I was about to say, what about the TV stations? First, in the film we just saw, there was a picture of one of the Jackson 2 newspapers. The word used with the photograph was brawl, B-R-A-W-L. Your students, journalism, it's a very powerful word. The TV that night showed the demonstrators coming to the counter. The first 3, and for the first 20 or 30 minutes, it was fairly peaceful. And then the TV showed the manager putting up a rope and closing off the almost deserted counter. The mob had already left. And you see all these empty seats with 3 demonstrators. And the newspaper said, after the demonstrators got to the counter, trouble broke out. Trouble, brawl. What does that say? You can ask them in classes.
It is, by my count, 1:45. We've got about 5 minutes, and I'm wondering if anyone, if we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Please, no speeches. Just ask a direct question, and you can direct it to any member of the panel you want. Yes, sir.
Mainly for Ed and Joan, following up on the media thing, how do you feel that local media was a factor in, let's say, media or community attitudes in the lead up to, during, and in the aftermath of the event?
Well, the local media was crucial. We had to demonstrate, as I said, to the nation. We knew it had to go through television and print media. In Jackson, the TV was especially important because it was related to national networks. But in Jackson, at the NBC station, when Martin Luther King would appear explaining something, the television station would run "Sorry, cable trouble" signs. The power of that is that they knew their white listeners might begin to think and that their black viewers would be inspired. I was part of a suit starting with Tougaloo College, which changed American television growing out of this period. Medgar Evers was allowed to give a famous speech, and the text of it'll be available on TV, only because the TV station carried the mayor who attacked Medgar and the NAACP by name, and under the old fairness doctrine, they had to give him equal time. Congress has since wiped out those things that protect our freedom of speech.
Yeah, we don't have to be fair anymore.
So the NBC affiliates suppressed the true story?
Yes, and eventually lost their license. But after years, with the United Church of Christ and the Methodist Church putting up probably over $1 million for a dozen years of TV fights.
The unfortunate thing about this event, there was a lot of TV, there were cameramen there. Actually, one of the cameramen got punched and knocked out during the demonstration because they thought that if they got rid of the media, they wouldn't be able to cover it. But a lot of the footage has since been lost. So there's very precious little that Loki was able to find in putting the film together and that I was able to find in trying to do my research.
But the reporters, and particularly the cameramen, were like a body shield for us. We would have been killed without them there to record it. And often in demonstrations, the media were the first attacked to keep the story from going out as dramatically. So I always like to thank the media.
Yeah, there was an insult. You don't really mean this. You're just doing this to get in the press. Hallelujah. Yes, we were. This is America.
So the moral for that for journalism students is wear body armor.
Yes.
Bill, I have one more little story that if we are finishing up, because we are at a journalism school, I think you need to know a little bit about the actual photographer who took this famous picture. He was a native Jacksonian. His name is Fred Blackwell. He's still alive. He was 22 years old when he took this photograph. He had just started working several months before for the Jackson Daily News. He actually knew some of the kids in the crowd. He had gone to school with them and their siblings. And this photograph changed his life. It was never a photograph that was put up for any of the prizes. At the time, the Pulitzer Prize, you had to enter, the newspaper had to enter the picture for the prize. And of course, the Jackson Daily News wasn't about to enter a picture like this in 1963 for any prize. But Fred Blackwell stood his ground, took a number of exceptional photographs that day, and had a change of heart about segregation as he watched hour after hour this type of behavior going on, and his own neighbors and friends acting in this way. He realized, and he told me in a very emotional tone, that while he was shooting these photographs, he realized, in his words, they were right and we were wrong. Changed his whole life.
Right. I think we've run out of time. I know that in like 2 minutes there's going to be some class changes. I just want to take care of a couple of things. I want to thank our panelists. Y'all have been great. This is fascinating.